over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Good afternoon and welcome back. My guest wrote a piece entitled "The West versus the Cuba of Africa." And he says the Western hegemonists hate Cuba just as they hate what he first described as the Cuba of Africa 15 years ago. The similarities between these two small, independent, revolutionary socialist countries are so striking that the analogy is easy to make. What are those similarities? Where is the Cuba of Africa? Well, let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
So here's the point. We have a tendency, welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. So here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand and appreciate the broader historical context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is, according to my guest, first, Cuba came to power through the armed struggle against imperialism, successfully driving the Western-installed compradors out of their country. Cuba is the only country in Latin America to have achieved a people's government through the armed struggle via the barrel of a gun. The Cuba of Africa achieved its independence in the same way. What country is this? Well, let's talk with my guest. He's an educator and historian who lived and reported from Eritrea from 2006 to 2021. At one time, he was the most widely distributed independent journalist in Africa. Thomas C. Mountain. Man, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thanks for having me on. This is the first time on this podcast.
It is. We used to talk regularly on the Critical Hour, and now we are reconnecting again. But Thomas, before we get to our discussion about the Cuba of Africa, there's another issue that I want to touch on quickly. Last Sunday, tens of thousands marched in the Netherlands to protest against Gaza genocide. Let's watch this clip and let's have a discussion about it for a moment.
First rally in decades, an estimated 100,000 people took to the streets of The Hague on Sunday to demand the government finally draw a red line against Israel. Families came from all over the country wearing red clothes.
I'm 70 years old. It's the first demonstration. It's important enough.
A recent survey shows that support for the government's backing of Israel has halved from 30% shortly after October 2023 to only 15% now. It also shows that 60% of Dutch people want the government to take a tougher stance on Israel, including those who vote for conservative and right-wing parties. Media director Jan Slachter, like many here, grew up with the idea that after the Holocaust, support for Israel was a given, not anymore.
Dat komt door de beelden die ik heb gezien.
The images have made the difference for me. Hearing the word famine is different than seeing how famine looks like. If you see a child looking like a skeleton who has no food, no water, nothing, that has really hit me. This is the limit for me. It has to stop and has actually gone too far already.
Cities around the country have now adopted the word genocide to describe Israel's actions in Gaza after the mayor of Amsterdam.
Thomas, for me, there are a couple of issues here. One is the size of the protest. Issue number two is the fact that hardly anybody in the West, in terms of Western media, saw any coverage of this. And so there's a media blackout, and all of that tells me that the Zionists are losing if they have not lost control of the narrative, and that's when they become the most dangerous. Thomas Mountain, your thoughts?
Well, I'm not new to this struggle of the Palestinian people. In 1982, I started my support for their struggle when Israel invaded Lebanon. I mean, I wrote a poem at the Sabra and Shatila massacre. It was published on Counterpunch eventually. So, for over 40 years, this has been something that's a cancer in the side of the humanity. And I've been, it's just like regularly appalled with what's going on. So now to see, I remember when Alex Odia, one of our fellow activists we worked with, he was in Los Angeles, got assassinated by a letter bomb for speaking out very mildly to saying, when they had the Achille Lauro hijacking, that, maybe the Palestinians helped to get that resolved. I mean, he got assassinated for saying that. So, to see this big protest in the Netherlands, which I spent some time there, it's pretty amazing because this tide has turned. I don't think there's any going back. I mean, just the statistics about Jewish Americans, especially young Jewish Americans, being repelled by Israel's barbarity and this genocide they're creating. I think it's turned. I mean, I don't think there's no going back. So I think this is like a big deal.
Yeah, I was shocked when I saw the video of this protest and realized this wasn't on MSNBC, this wasn't on CNN, this wasn't covered anywhere. And this is real. And for that older gentleman to say that for years he thought support of Israel was just an assumption, that there was no question. And then he says, but now all of that has changed. When I heard that coming from Europe, I said, oh, they've lost control of the narrative now.
Yeah, even in the United States, I think they've lost control. I mean, it's if the Zionist lobby, AIPAC, and these people, if they weren't so desperately afraid, they wouldn't have to spend all this money controlling Congress. If there was that much support for Israel, they wouldn't have to have a minder for every congressman on the Hill. That's a lot of money they're spending. Why? Because they know they're losing control of the narrative, and they're pretty desperate to keep it that way. So, that's why I think it explains this clamp down on college campuses. This young woman makes a speech at the George Washington graduation, and now she's banned from the campus. So it's like, what's going on here is because they're panicking. The reality is, U.S. imperialism Israel is their main colony in West Asia, more accurately than the Middle East, and they're panicking because they're isolated and they're not really winning. They're killing a lot of people, but they're being increasingly isolated in the international community.
Shelly H just posted Kamala Harris married her AIPAC minder. Well said, Shelly H. I thought it was worth the audience seeing this protest in the Netherlands at The Hague and the size of this thing. There were a lot of people out there wearing red, and again, for it to be totally ignored, I thought was worthy of note. We got to welcome some new members to the Connecting the Dots, the CTD Club. Wars of Paradigm and Vincent Robinson. Thank you so much for your support. Greatly appreciate it. that'll go a very long way in helping us continue with this program. So now, Thomas C. Mountain, to what we actually brought you on to discuss, the West versus the Cuba of Africa. And let me read this first paragraph again. The Western hegemonists hate Cuba just as they hate what you first described as the Cuba of Africa 15 years ago. The similarities between these two small, independent, revolutionary socialist countries are so striking that the analogy is easy to make. Thomas, where is the Cuba of Africa, and explain some of the similarities, please?
Well, this is Eritrea, the Cuba of Africa. It's on the Horn of Africa, on the Red Sea coast, southern Red Sea coast, across from Yemen and Saudi Arabia. It's bordered by Sudan on the north, Ethiopia to the south, and across the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So the Bab al-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, the opening between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, is this strategically critical choke point that controls the traffic between all the shipping between Europe and Asia, which are the two largest trading partners in the world. So for many years, the United States, since World War II, was very concerned about controlling this very critically strategic area, this Red Sea, this Bab al-Mandeb, which Eritrea sits right on. So, you've seen this big fiasco of the Americans attacking the Houthis, and the Houthis, the Ansarallah, running them off. American had to withdraw their aircraft carriers because of the poorest, most destitute Arab country could chase them off. The Houthis, they're not even really halfway but a country. So, the Americans are very concerned about this part of the world, about this Red Sea, controlling it because it's strategically critical to control the economies of Asia and Europe. So, Eritrea has been sitting right there, sort of like Cuba is sitting right next to the United States. And, and just like Cuba is the only country to come to power in Latin America through the armed struggle, Eritrea is the only country in Africa to actually complete the armed struggle and drive their colonial powers, the Ethiopians, out from Eritrea and liberate their country. So this United States doesn't go for that. The way the United States controls their neo-colonies is through the IMF and World Bank locking you into debt bondage as soon as you get so-called independence, and through bought, rigged, or stolen elections. So, the Western democracy, right? So Eritrea doesn't have elections. Cuba doesn't have like Western-style elections, right? So they're popular governments. They're supported by their people. They don't have this charade of democracy, what we call it. It's like choose between Biden and Trump. I mean, come on. So both of these countries are walking the independent line. They're not about to kneel down to the West, and particularly Eritrea, the national motto is never kneel down. I mean, the Eritreans tell you, we only kneel for two things. One is to pray, and the other is to shoot. So, that's what these two countries have so much in common. I mean, over the years, it's like other people have picked up on it a bit, the Cuba of Africa, right? So, Eritrea and Cuba came to power through the armed struggle. Both countries would not take money from the IMF and the World Bank. Eritrea was destroyed in their independence war, 30 years of genocidal occupation by the Ethiopian regime. And they had nothing. I mean, Libya and Botswana, the only other two countries in Africa, aren't in debt to the World Bank or IMF. And they're both rich, Libya through oil and Botswana through diamonds. But Eritrea had nothing. And they still refused to take that carrot dangling in front of them by the banksters of the IMF and the World Bank. And it forged a independent, what I call a socialist economy. I lived there for 15 years, and officially the government doesn't say socialist, but I mean, Eritrea, they own all the land. The government owns all the land. It's, public land. Everybody nationalized, just like in Cuba. It's a hallmark of socialism. When if the government doesn't own the land. If the land doesn't belong to the people, it's not socialism. So, it's both Eritrea and Cuba, that's the case. You can't buy and sell land because how can you own something you didn't create? I mean, so, and the other things that Eritrea has, and similar to Cuba, it's like national health service. Both countries struggle really hard, work really hard, and spend a lot of their resources making sure as best they can that their people's health is taken care of. Both countries guarantee education, free public education, all the way up to university levels and graduate levels. So, two other signposts of a socialist society. So, it's like the similarities go on and on and on. I mean, and both countries have been sanctioned by the West, by the United States, brutal sanctions that cost the lives and suffering of their people for many, many years for both countries. So, in Eritrea's case, they even had the UN Security Council put sanctions on Eritrea, claiming they were supporting terrorism in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, which was a complete fabrication. It's all been exposed since then. So, Eritrea and Cuba, the Americans accuse Cuba of supporting terrorism. So, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Why? Because Cuba and Eritrea are what we call the threat of a good example, where the rest of Latin America is threatened by Cuba's good example. Well, the Cubans have all these things that those countries don't, even though his life is hard in Cuba because of the U.S. economic sanctions and literally economic warfare the United States has been waging on Cuba, as well as Venezuela. But the same thing with Eritrea. The sanctions Eritrea has been under have been pretty brutal. So, I mean, Eritrea, you can't wire money in or out of the country. The United States has put them on the SWIFT blacklist. And it's just on and on and on, official and unofficial sanctions the United States has implemented against Eritrea. But in spite of all that, in spite of this, what we call climate disaster, I mean, the canary in the coal mine for climate disaster, we call global warming, it's been the Sahel in Africa, and Eritrea is in the Sahel. I mean, in the middle of their 30-year war for independence from 1961 to 1991, we had that famous Michael Jackson, "We Are the World," for the drought, the famine in Ethiopia. Well, half of those people were actually in Eritrea, and they were cut off from any aid by the genocidal Mengistu regime that ran Ethiopia at the time. So, Eritrea was suffering under this climate disaster way back over 50 years ago. And the canary in the coal mine, the Sahel in Africa, is showing where everything is headed. So Eritrea has been getting hammered by climate disaster. Cuba is getting hammered by hurricanes, increasing and stronger hurricanes damaging, coming in and wiping out Cuba. And that's from, mainly Western fueled climate change, climate disaster, heating up the planet. And Eritrea has primarily been a rain-fed agricultural economy. 70% of the people are involved in rain-fed agriculture for their subsistence, for their survival. And now they've had, there's been a series of droughts. They had 2 record-breaking 2-year droughts in Eritrea. Never happened before in history. So, Cuba and Eritrea have both been getting hammered by Western-caused climate disaster. So that, again, there's similarities after similarities. The Cuba of Africa, Eritrea.
So you mentioned that Eritrea is in the Sahel, and they're a socialist country. So what are we expecting, or are we expecting to see Eritrea join the alliance of Sahel states?
Well, Eritrea is on the far eastern side of the Sahel. The alliance of Sahel states are like thousands of miles away on the western.
Right.
So, they do have similarities. I mean, half of Eritrea is Muslim, half is Christian. The Sahel states are all Muslim, right? But, the Sahel states were under France, and Eritrea was under Italy, then Britain, and then Ethiopia. So there's cultural and other differences. But, of course, Eritrea supports what's going on in the Sahel states. Of course, they support that. And they support independence, and they look forward to all the African nations breaking with their neo-colonialist controls of the Western countries. And so this is a very positive thing. And I know that Eritrea is very pleased to hear about what's going on in the Sahel states.
Do you know, because I know the Prime Minister of Somalia has met with President Traore in Burkina Faso. Now, I know Somalia and Burkina Faso are a lot closer together. I understand that. I mean, geographically. But do you expect there to be, or do you know of, communication between the leadership of both countries? You just said that that Eritrea supports what's going on in the alliance of Sahel states. Are there any elements of evidence to support that position?
Well, Eritrea is fundamentally a Pan-Africanist country. So they're immediately concerned with their neighbors that are in crisis. I mean, Sudan's in the middle of a civil war, which is instigated and led and funded by the United Arab Emirates. And Ethiopia is in the middle of a civil war, which has been funded by the United Arab Emirates against the popular movements against them. So Eritrea is, and even Somalia, they got their hands full with this Al-Shabaab, which apparently has had a lot of support from the Arab states. So Eritrea's got its hands full just trying to keep its neighbors from, civil war breaking out all around it. And Eritrea is just a small country, 4 million people. But so Eritrea has been playing a very positive role in all three countries. And they, I know they do outreach as much as they can, but it's just a small country, 4 million people and very limited resources. So, but, I know from their past practice, and I know from talking to leadership in the region, that they support any anti-imperialist, anti-colonial actions of anybody in Africa. So that, as far as proof goes, I just know that's their track record.
And I'm glad you put it in the context of anti-imperialists, because when I have conversations with analysts about these various issues, one of the points that I try to stress is when you boil it down to its most basic elements, we're talking imperialism versus anti-imperialism. That's at the end of the day, you can take all the ideological stuff you want to, and the balkanization of Russia and all of that stuff. It comes down to anti-imperialism versus imperialism.
Yeah, and it's also come down to some really concrete things. For example, the standard of living in the Western countries is really dependent on the super exploitation of Africans. I mean, France gets it's got a big treasury full of gold. None of it came from France. It came from the Sahel. France has got all this uranium powering up their electrical generation. It makes the standard of living in the French so high. It's all uranium that was basically ripped off of the Sahel. So, Eritrea has come in and said, they're in the Arab Nubian Shield, which is one of the richest mineral zones in the planet. And they're starting to develop their mining industry. And, for example, you go down to Tanzania and there's the biggest gold mine in the world owned by Anglo-American, and they pay 10% royalty. Well, Eritrea gets 40% royalty for their gold. I mean, of course, they purchased a share of the mine, but they get 40%. They're not just getting 10%. So, this super exploitation of Africans is just not happening in Eritrea, sort of like Cuba doesn't let their country be super exploited. So, Eritrea has been, they know all about imperialism. It was U.S. imperialism that gave Eritrea to Ethiopia instead of giving Eritrea independence after World War II. Eritrea was a colony of the Italians. They weren't never under the Ethiopians or the Abyssinians before that. And
as Ethiopia was a colony of Italy.
For 5 years, yes, they were. Ethiopia, people say, there's so much propaganda, just historical fiction about Ethiopia. They never were colonized. Italy invaded Ethiopia. They established the first railroad system in Ethiopia, the first telegraph system, the first telephone system, the first nationwide road networks, the first nationwide educational system were all established by the Italians in 5 years. Ethiopia was colonized by Italy. Okay, but no, we were never colonized. No, that's just not true. So, all this misinformation has been very much a problem in people understanding what's going on. And the demonization of Eritrea has been part of this misinformation. But that's starting to get broken down. Some very famous Tigrayan Ethiopians, land of the TPLF, former regime leaders of Ethiopia, are now in Eritrea for Independence Day. Tomorrow's May 24th, Eritrean Independence Day. And the people that we thought would like lifelong enemies against Eritrea from Ethiopia are now in Eritrea celebrating Eritrean independence. Eritrean independence brought down the Mengistu regime in 1991. Literally, Mengistu got run out of the country by the Eritrean military victories against the Ethiopian occupation army. So there's all this like Eritrea got independence. Oh my God, this is like Eritrea was given to Ethiopia by the Americans. The Dulles brothers from the CIA and the State Department infamously said, Eritrea should, I'm paraphrasing, Eritrea is supposed to get independence after World War II, but it's in our U.S. national interest to give them to Ethiopia as a reward so that we can use Ethiopia as their U.S. policeman on the beat in the strategically critical Horn of Africa. So, I mean, it's sort of like Cuba was colonized by the U.S. and they almost won their independence in 1898, and then the U.S. came in and colonized them after defeating the Spanish. Eritrea was supposed to have independence after World War II, and the Americans just gave them Ethiopia. So Eritrea had to fight for 30 years to get independence from Ethiopia. So, this struggle for independence at the barrel of a gun is what's really shaped both societies, especially Eritreans. I mean, my wife was in the war. 14 years. She ran away when she was 14 years old and joined the armed struggle for national liberation. So she's just one of the generation that, put aside everything and just went off to fight for their country, and they won. It was victory. So I think that's what everybody will be celebrating tomorrow in Asmara. They've already started celebrating. I mean, they're partying in the streets because of 34 years of independence.
Shelley H., thank you very much for that super sticker. War of Paradigm, who joined the Connecting the Dots, the CTD Club, says, thank you for the shout out. I've been listening to you for years and appreciate the thought-provoking content. Keep up the good work. Well, War of Paradigm, thank you for the compliments. And it's only through contributions, through supporters like yourself, that we can keep this effort afloat. You mentioned you mentioned the drought. And one of the things we know that's also been causing a lot of conflict and consternation is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the impact on the regional flow of water. Can you speak to that? Because the description that the United States, or the narrative that the United States provides, it tends to be a little different than reality.
Well, the water distribution from the dam on the Nile, they call the GERD, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's basically all of that was settled except for when if there's a drought and where the water's who's gonna get the water when there's a drought. So, there's actually hasn't really been serious water restrictions. But the thing is, see, Ethiopia built this dam, spent all this money when they could have, to generate 6,000 megawatts of electricity, which really isn't, for a country of 120 million people, isn't that much electricity. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what Ethiopia could have done is built a lot of smaller dams and generated more electricity for less than what they spent building this great big dam without threatening the Nile River flow. But they didn't. They had to build this great big dam and show to everybody that Ethiopia is an imperial power in Africa, and we're going to show them who's who. So I mean, the GERD, this big dam on the Nile, has always been sort of something. I mean, as far as I know, it was actually originally an idea from the World Bank, who was famous for building rivers, dams across rivers and destroying all this ecology around the world. But it's sort of like, us Ethiopians, so we're building this great big dam, and Egypt can't tell us what to do with the water. Well, Egypt's survival is dependent on the Nile River. So, they have to negotiate. They have to work on this, and you just don't threaten people. So, for the first place, the big dam they built, it just wasn't needed. And it's actually not going to solve the major problems of electricity shortages in Ethiopia, because they have the dam, but they don't have electricity out to the countryside, to the people. 120 million people, 80 million people don't have electricity because there's no distribution network. And even if there was a distribution network, what's 6,000 megawatts going to do? I mean, it's just not going to supply a country of 120 million people. So, that dam is sort of a suspicious red flag about Ethiopian chauvinism from the get-go. But, it's a long story.
Well, let me go back to something you mentioned very early in the conversation, and that is Ansar Allah in Yemen, the Bab al-Mandab Strait and the Red Sea. You've got Yemen on one side of the strait, you've got Eritrea on the other side of the strait. First question is, at its narrowest point, how far across is the Bab al-Mandab Strait?
It's less than 20 miles at the narrowest point. I think it's about 16 miles at the narrowest point, maybe less. It's pretty narrow.
Right. So that is a major choke point as you're trying to exit the Red Sea through the Bab al-Mandab Strait into the Gulf of Aden, which then takes you out to the ocean. What's the relationship between Eritrea and Yemen? Are they operating in concert? Because as we hear about all of this conflict and the missiles that are coming from Yemen attacking Israeli traffic in the Red Sea, and the United States military fleet, is Eritrea playing any role in that conflict?
Well, Eritrea is, I think privately Eritrea is pleased with what the Ansar Allah, the Houthis, did chasing the Americans out. I mean, Americans threatened Eritrea for many, many years. They tried to take their ports and supported Ethiopia in invading Eritrea and trying to destroy Eritrea. So Eritrea is happy to see the U.S. Navy run off. Now, I wrote a story way back when the war broke out in Yemen, I think 2015, where
between Yemen and the Saudis.
Well, before this, Yemen and the Saudis, first the Houthis and the former president Saleh Abdullah made a deal to take over Yemen. See, Yemen was divided North and South Yemen, and the North Yemen is the Houthis, which are basically a Shia offshoot, and the South Yemen are Sunnis. So there's been a long history. There used to be North and South Yemen, and it was actually Eritrea that organized the negotiations that unified Yemen in 1990 before Eritrea even came to independence. So South Yemen is where the oil is, and the North Yemen is where the Houthis are. So the Houthis made a deal with the president of Yemen, whose son was the head of the Yemen military, to basically do a coup and take over all of Yemen. And because the Houthis have some support from Iran at the time, Saudi Arabia Iran is the big snake, right? Saudi Arabia said, no, you're not going to take over all of Yemen. And Houthi says, who's going to stop us? So Saudi intervened militarily and defended basically the Yemenis who are Sunni in the south. And so this war broke out, but the Saudis intervened and they put a blockade on Yemen. It was a genocidal blockade. They bombed just everywhere in Yemen. They destroyed everything. I mean, there basically wasn't anything for the United States and Israel to bomb anymore, because the Saudis had already bombed it for 5 years. But then, the Houthis got their missiles together. They used to have Scud missiles when the southern Yemen was aligned with the Soviet Union. So they upgraded those Scud missiles basically all on their own. I mean, all this talk about the Iranian support is pretty much, the Iranian support from the Houthis. How come the Houthis haven't been able to sink any American warships with all these latest high-powered Iranian anti-ship missiles? Because they don't have any. The Iranians hasn't given them the support. But the Houthis upgraded their Scuds and they were able to, drive the Americans out, So it's like, whoa, this is a big, big deal. And so Eritrea is like, everybody's happy. I mean, Americans are gone. I mean, Trump could say what he wants. Oh, we defeated them. They humiliated them, but they're pretty tough. And you're good fighters. I was like, everybody had a good laugh at that one.
Because they've been fighting a long time. They've been, they didn't become Ansar Allah by accident. So where do you write, in the transition from imperialist domination to independence, both Cuba and Eritrea rejected Western neo-colonialist economic control by refusing to fall into the debt trap of the Western bankers. And you've mentioned the World Bank, but talk about how significant that is, that they've been able to avoid the debt trap of the IMF and the World Bank.
Well, the way the banksters in the West control their neo-colonial projects in Africa and South America, Latin America, is through debt bondage. I mean, they come in at independence and they promise you, oh, you're going to be able to make all this money selling these commodities and that commodities, and we're going to loan you all this money, knowing full well that they're not going to be able to pay it back. And so once they can't pay it back, they say, oh, well, you owe us all this money, so you got to borrow more money And this is the conditions to borrow more money. You have to cut your medical spending. You have to cut your educational spending. You have to cut subsidies for food and fuel and everything else to pay us back. Okay. And basically, the IMF and the World Bank takes money from private Western banks and lends it to these countries with basically guarantees it'll get paid back. It's risk-free loans. And these guys are getting 7-8% interest on their loans and borrowing it for 1% or less than 0%. So, they come in, they get you in the debt trap, and then they control you. It's just like they got Egypt now. Egypt is like cutting back on their subsidies for food and fuel, and people's lives are getting really hard. But, the IMF and the World Bank are saying, man, you got to pay these loans back to the Western banksters. That comes first, and your people's second. So that's how they control these economies. And the other way they control
Wait a minute. And there's one more thing, because it's not only the debt bondage, it's what they incur the debt to build. Because, for example, Eritrea might say, I'll just pick a number. We need $100 million because we want to build 15 schools and 15 villages. And the World Bank will say, well, no, we're going to build you an airport. Well, we don't need an airport. We need to build 15 schools and 15 villages. Well, no, because Bechtel doesn't build schools. Bechtel builds airports. And lo and behold, you get a huge airport and no schools. Thomas Mountain.
Yeah, well, they what they really don't want to see is an educated, politically conscious population in any African country, because that's a threat to their control. I mean, they use debt bondage to control the economies, and they use what we call bot, steal, or rig elections to control who gets to be sitting in the president's palace. Because the elections in Africa are notoriously crooked and rigged, and I mean, I can just one after another across Africa. It's just like, oof. I mean, so Eritrea has rejected that. They said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to get into this game of vote for me and I'll set you free. We're going to work hard and concentrate our limited resources on raising the standard of living of the people. Sort of like what Cuba's been doing, right? Focusing on the things that really make a difference in the people's lives, like education and healthcare and other things like that. So, what the World Bank and IMF want you to do is they want you importing their finished products at a high price, and they want you to export your raw materials at a low price. They don't want anything. They don't want any self-sufficiency. They don't want people adding value to their products, manufacturing it in the country instead of having to import it from the Western countries. So, I mean, like, for example, Nigeria, at one point, I think they were getting $8 or $9 a barrel for their oil, because their percentage of their royalty is so low, and they had no ability to refine their own gasoline or diesel fuel, so they were paying $200 a barrel to import diesel fuel and getting $8 a barrel for their oil that they were exporting. So I mean, this is the IMF debt trap, right? The World Bank.
And they're having their ecology. It's an ecological disaster in terms of how they're extracting the resources. There's no concern for the ecology of the country. And so it's just becoming a desolate oil, what's the word I want to use? Wasteland.
Well, Eritrea's having a mining industry coming into Eritrea in a major way. And especially gold mining, they use a lot of chemicals like cyanide.
Right.
And the rest of Africa and in Latin America and other places, they make these big reservoirs with cyanide water in them and walk away and abandon. Mm-hmm. And then, you have a big flood come along and the reservoir walls are breached and the cyanide goes down the river and destroys everything. Well, Eritrea didn't allow that. I mean, they've state-of-the-art cyanide remediation work. They're not going to see their economy destroyed by this by exploitation. Because it's not Western exploitation. It's Eritrea's partners. I mean, it's a 40-60 deal where the rest of Africa, it's like 10% royalty, right? So Eritrea is like very careful about their environment. I mean, in some ways they're almost too careful. I mean, because it's a little bit conservative in terms of change. But on the other hand, Eritrea won't allow international trawlers to come in and rape their coastlines for fish. They're very protective of their marine ecology. You know what I'm saying? So there's a track record in Eritrea is to say, look, at independence, and when Eritrea was first invaded and colonized by Italy in the 1880s, 30% of Eritrea was forests, and there were year-round running rivers. By the time Eritrea got independence in 1991, less than 2% of the country was forested, and there were no year-round rivers. There was an ecological.
Where did the wood go? Was it harvestable lumber or? I'll just leave it there.
Well, just like in Haiti, you see all these forests that's cut down because there was places where the rebels could hide to resist the colonialists, right? So, I mean, that's one of the reasons all the trees were cut down. And the other was in the course of the war, people were so desperate for fuel that they went out and cut down trees and things like that. But I mean, it's like because of the war, because of the occupation by Ethiopia, and before that, the Italians, that, the country was deforested. So that was an ecological disaster. Eritrea's come to independence, the country has just been devastated. I mean, 30% to less than 2%. So Eritrea's had to work real hard to reforest their country. So, I mean, every summer, all the 10th grade kids at the end of the summer go to a reforestation plant. They all go out for 6 weeks and they plant trees in the countryside. All the kids in the country do that, to reforest the country. And the military is actually involved in building stone terraces on the hillsides to prevent soil erosion. So soil and water conservation is critical for Eritrea because they know. I mean, Eritrea has built over 700 medium and major dams to conserve their water so they can irrigate. So they're no longer dependent on rain-fed agriculture, which is disaster because, droughts are becoming worse and and more frequent. And so you have to irrigate, and they irrigate by retaining your water in these irrigation structures, 700 spread all around the country. So, Eritrea is looking at this, having to recover from this environmental holocaust that was inflicted upon it by colonialism. And as a result, Eritrea is, they didn't start off at zero, they start off negative. And they've had to rebuild all of this stuff. But you know what? Eritrea is almost self-sufficient in cereal grains and fruits and vegetables at this point. They've done all this since independence in 30 years, in spite of 2 major historic droughts, in spite of being invaded by Ethiopia and having 40% of their people internally displaced in the Ethiopian invasion of June of 2000, in spite of all these U.S. sanctions trying to put a hammerlock on their economy. Eritrea is continuing, the economy continuing to grow. So, that's what I mean. It's a threat of a good example. The rest of Africa, you've got famine, you've got starvation, you've got illiteracy, you've got basically failed states. I mean, when a country like Nigeria, which majority of the people live on less than $2 a day, when people can't go to school, they can't go to see a doctor. They're living in slums and these environmental wastelands, and they're pumping out how many billions of dollars every year in oil? How come that's not going to help the Nigerian people? So if the Nigerian people started realizing that, hey, the people in Eritrea got free education all the way up to university, they got free medical care, they got subsidized food benefits and rations, and how come we don't have that? And then they're going to start looking at why, and they're going to realize because they're super exploited by the West. So Eritrea, like Cuba, is a threat of a good example. And like in Latin America, the United States doesn't want the rest of Latin America start thinking like Cuba, be self-sufficient.
As to that point, as you were just saying that, I was thinking about Nicaragua. When you mentioned that Eritrea is just about food independent, the first thing that came to my mind was Nicaragua, because under Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua has been able to develop food independence, and the United States can't stand that threat of a good example.
Yes, well, they want another banana republic, right? They want Nicaragua exporting bananas, and they want Nicaragua importing the Western food. So, Nicaragua said, no, why should we do that? We've got fertile agricultural land. Let's feed our people first. So, I mean, I think that's, like you say, a threat of a good example. They don't, there's a lot of things about Nicaragua. They've been through a lot ups and downs since their victory in 1979. But my friend Gary Webb was there, and he had some eye-opening stories about what life was like after the the Contras came back to power. But it's like since then the Sandinistas have regained power and they're transforming the society and they become a target for the Americans. So the same way with Eritrea, the same way with Cuba. If you're doing good for your people, no, they're not going to like you.
They're not going to like you. So getting back to your piece, you talk about the Cuba of Africa. Eritrea was one of only 3 in Africa to transform from the imperialist domination. The other 2 were Libya and Botswana. And we know what happened to Gaddafi in Libya. Wealthy from diamond exports, had no need for outside funding. Eritrea had nothing at independence, but now you talk about they had been ravaged by genocidal policy by its colonial occupiers. And getting back to the Alliance of Sahel States, there seems to be a major shift in the ideology and the mentality of African nations, and Eritrea is part of that change.
Well, I had a conversation with an old buddy of mine. He's a mining guy. He's been all over 35, 40 years in Africa, all over Africa. And he spent time in the Sahel states and he spent over 25 years in Eritrea. So he was saying, this big changes in the Sahel states now. They're very positive changes, but they're brand new. I mean, it's just only been a couple of years. And so you got to be a little cautious about all this because there's a backlash coming from the imperialists, the French especially. They're not going to sit back and let the lose there, because like even the French presidents for generations have been saying, we lose Africa, French is going to become a third world country.
Well, they're going to use ECOWAS, and they're going to use AFRICOM. Hence, you've got General Langley talking about Chirare needs to be arrested because he's using Burkina Faso or Burkina Bay resources to protect himself, which a leader is supposed to do. And I mean, that's what the United States does. They use American resources for a military. So talk a bit about what you see, what you project, how ECOWAS is going to respond to this, and what do you see AFRICOM doing relative to this?
Well, actually, right now, the biggest threat to the Sahel states is these Islamic fanatics.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And basically armed
by the United States
with weapons from Libya. I mean, the destruction of Libya destabilized the whole of northern Africa. And so now you've got these heavily armed religious fanatics attacking these Sahel, and they're being backed by the French. I mean, when the jihadists almost took over Mali some years back, the French intervened, and the Mali people said, yeah, we don't want these guys French, okay. But the French chased them all the way back to the north and trapped them in a little town called Kona. They could have wiped them all out then. And the French let them leave. The French wanted them to continue existence to justify the French involvement in the country. Oh, we're fighting terrorists. You can't kick us out. So, the French have a history of not just allowing, but actually increasingly supporting behind the scenes jihadists and other terrorists. I mean, it's like in Syria. I mean, right, the guy that was the most wanted, $10 million on his head, now is the president of the country, is a Democrat, right? Okay, so the French are, looking at these jihadists as a tool to destabilize and eventually overthrow their leadership and of the Sahel states. So they're the major threat, okay? ECOWAS, I mean, they threatened to come into, well, if you have to restore democracy, or we're going to come in and man, that was all just bluster and bluff. And none of that worked. Now ECOWAS is sort of like looked at as sort of like a kind of a feeble outfit. But, but of course, in AFRICOM would like to be able to do things, but there's very little they can do because, I mean, we're not talking about America's having bases there. I mean, when Niger kicked out the French puppet, they kicked out the Americans as well as the French. The Americans lost their major intelligence gathering base, their drone base in Niger. So, I mean, all of a sudden, the Americans have been cut off from major intelligence that they're not only using in Africa, they're using going all the way, picking up signals all the way up into West Asia. So all of a sudden, that base is closed. So, the Americans are like, oh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? All we got is a base in Djibouti. You know what I'm saying? Where are we going to go? How are we going to? The Americans are panicking, and then now they got run out of the Horn of Africa by the Houthis. So the Americans are going to bluster and bluff, but they're not in a position where they can do a whole lot other than secretly fund the jihadists, which of course they have a history of doing, right? So, but again, it's only been a couple of years, and there's a report. Garland Nixon was on a program with Jyoti Brar last week, and she said that there's 700 North Korean commandos in Burkina Faso, and providing security for the country. Well, I mean, to an Eritrean, the idea that you'd have to have foreign people come in that provide security to the country is totally alien. We can defend ourselves. We don't need foreigners to come here and defend us. But that shows that if that report's true, that shows that, the stress that the Burkina Faso government's under, that they're allowing foreign military forces to come in and help defend their country. I mean, it's one thing for Wagner to come train them. It's another thing for 700 North Korean commandos to come in and play a security role. So, the situation in the Sahel countries, the three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, is not as stable as people would, and so I kind of tell people, look, man, this is like a long struggle. I mean, in a couple of years, how are you going to transform your country from being an abject colonial stooge to being an independent revolutionary socialist country in a couple of years? That's just not going to happen. It's going to be a long, brutal struggle ahead of them. So people should be careful. And like my friend Alistair was saying, when he's talking to people about, the Sahel states, he says, why don't you guys look at Eritrea? It's been around for 34 years now, and they've been successful. They're growing. They're independent. Why don't you look at that as a role model, how to do things? It's good that the Sahel things are happening, but they're new, and the leaders are young, and they're going to be some hard knocks down the road, and who knows if they're actually going to survive or not. Eritrea survived all kind of, disasters and invasions and everything, and they're getting stronger. So let's look for a role model in Africa that's successful, and not just successful for a few years, but successful for decades. And then you don't have to copy everything, but what are they doing right? You know what I'm saying? I mean, for example, water conservation. These Sahel states are being this disaster with droughts. Now they should be out there building massive, everywhere that they can. They should be able to conserve water. Every village that's possible should put a micro dam up and trap water there. They have water for irrigation, and water goes underground and it adds to their underground water table. So that's one example Eritrea does. You know what I'm saying? That these countries could copy, or emulate, I should say. So there's, we try to say, look, Africa got a long way to go, and you got to look for positive role models. And that's why I'm saying the Cuba of Africa is the role model.
You mentioned Djibouti, and Djibouti is between Eritrea and Somaliland, I believe. And so there's a U.S. intel base in Djibouti. How concerned are the Eritreans that base in Djibouti will be used to destabilize Eritrea?
Well, it's not only a U.S. base there. There's a great big French base there, too. Thousands of French troops in Djibouti. But the Chinese have got a big base there, too. The biggest military base now in Djibouti is the Chinese. It's the only Chinese foreign military base outside of China is in Djibouti.
Right.
So Djibouti is sort of like playing all sides of the game here, right? And they're just a little country, about half a million people. And they even got their own civil war between the Somalis and the Afars are fighting in Djibouti. So, the government's corrupt, and they've historically been like a province of Ethiopia, really. But, that's where Ethiopia, when they broke relations with Eritrea in 1998, they moved all their trade through the Djibouti port, even though it's small and antiquated. But the Americans have a big base there. I mean, way back in 2008, I wrote about how the Eritreans, the Eritrean highlands overlooked Djibouti, and they overlooked the U.S. military base in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier, and they're all within artillery range of the Eritrean highlands. And the Eritreans, knowing that the Americans would like to take over those highlands, put their troops and so that they couldn't happen. And then one morning, the American intelligence people in Washington, D.C. looked at a map and said, "Oh my God, look, there's troops on the highlands overlooking a base, and they could put artillery there, and they could shut down our base." And that way, this little pipsqueak country, Eritrea, could tell the biggest power in the world that you can't or cannot do something in the Horn of Africa. So, the Americans tried to use Djibouti to attack Eritrea. And Djibouti, they sent an army up, and the Eritreans just wiped them out. I mean, I remember talking to some Eritreans that were there, and it was like, whew, thousands came, and then we had to bury their bodies with bulldozers. So, I mean, it's like, so Djibouti has played a kind of a nasty role in the past now, but they're just a little country. And Eritrea's main concern is Somalia and Sudan and Ethiopia. Djibouti's sort of, they got a lot of bases there, but I don't overplay their importance.
So if you, as we wrap this up, first of all, two questions. First question, what are the three most salient points you want the audience to take away as you drew the comparison between Cuba and Eritrea in your piece?
Well, the fact is that there's a role model for African countries and other countries to emulate in national independence and self-sufficiency, and to take care of your people. Revolutionary socialist position. That's one thing. And then the other thing is Eritrea is also very active in a Pan-Africanist sense in trying to bring peace to its neighbors. I mean, Sudan just recently has been coming out and saying, we thank Eritrea because they help us reconstitute our military and start to defeat the United Arab Emirates coup attempt against our country. Mm-hmm. And of course, even in Ethiopia, the Tigrayans and other people have been historical enemies of Eritrea, now coming around and saying, oh, why were we fighting with Eritrea all these years? They want to help us. So, I mean, people should realize when you see all these articles demonizing Eritrea in the Western media, this is just what I call them liars for hire. It's paid propaganda. It's got no basis in reality. I mean, I lived there for 15 years. My wife was just back there this year. And, it's like, no, it's not like they say. Eritrea is not this failed state, this police state. You can't even find police on the street. The policemen don't even carry firearms. They don't even carry batons. They carry ticket books to give traffic tickets. That's what their police state's all about. I mean, so, that's one role. And the other thing is that don't believe anything you read and almost nothing you see about Eritrea in the Western media. That's my role, my good golden rule.
And if you look, just project 2 or 3 years out, the landscape. Again, looking at the model of Eritrea and looking at the developments of the Alliance of Sahel States and some of the other Western African countries, what's your projection going forward?
Well, actually, there's a big push for Ethiopia and BRICS. And Ethiopia is a failed state. I mean, the government maybe controls 20% of the country, just the capital. Mm-hmm. The prime minister is the mayor of Addis Ababa. 80% of the country is out of control of the government. These are ethnic armed groups that are trying to overthrow the Ethiopian government. There's 120 million people, and that's coming to a head. And I think by the end of the year, it's going to come to a head. Okay, maybe a little longer than that, but I don't think it's going to be any longer than that. So, I mean,
and what is that? When you say come to a head, what does that mean?
Well, the Abiy machine, Abiy's going to have to get on a plane and flee Ethiopia like Mengistu did back in 1991. He's not going to be able to stay in power. And what's going to come about? Is it going to remain in Ethiopia, a united country, or is Ethiopia going to separate into smaller countries? I mean, the Oromos are 45, 50 million countries, the big 45, 50 million people, the largest nation in Africa. And for a long time, they wanted independence. So, I mean, whether, even there's reports coming out of Eritrea that maybe Eritrea is starting to support that the long-term best interest of the Ethiopian people maybe is in nationalism and not in this empire of Ethiopia. So, I mean, that's like, whoa. And of course, then there's Sudan, the civil war in Sudan, which is now being won by the Sudanese government with the support of the Eritreans. And
Eritrea borders both Sudan and Ethiopia.
And Ethiopia, right. And so, and Eritrea has been very active in supporting the attempts to end the rebellion, this coup attempt by the UAE instigated. So when Sudan comes, in another year, Sudan may be at peace. And in 6 months, Ethiopia may have gotten rid of Abiy Ahmed and may have started to be able to rebuild their country. and start because he's just been ripping off the country and spending money on ridiculous things. They got millions of people starving. They got millions of refugees. They've got their medical system has collapsed. Their educational system collapsed. They got a lot of work to do to get Ethiopia back on its feet, right? So, in a few years, hopefully, and as far as Eritrea goes, the mining industry is starting to expand, growing Eritrea. They got a new mine should be open by the end of the year, a copper mine. They got a potash fertilizer mine, biggest and new one in the world, supposed to come online by the end of next year. So this is going to bring in hundreds of millions of dollars to Eritrea, which is going to see Eritrea be able to not only develop its own economy, but to reach out to its neighbors with help. So I think the next few years, you're going to see a lot of changes. And I think a lot of it's going to be coming, like I say, all roads to peace in the Horn of Africa run through Asmara, Eritrea.
Thomas C. Mountain. Man, it's been too long, but now we're back. Looking forward to more conversations such as this. The audience obviously loves you. A number of folks have been saying that, they've seen you on other shows and they're giving you nothing but your props. Thomas Mountain, thank you. Greatly appreciate it. Look forward to having you back. Have a wonderful, wonderful holiday and have a wonderful Eritrean Independence Day.
That's right. Await Nahafash means victory to the masses in Eritrea.
I was thinking the exact same thing. My brother. Thank you. Great. And thank your wife as well. Greatly appreciate it. Folks, thank you all for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New shows next week. Dr. Jim Kavanaugh will join us on Monday. And please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. To all of you that are joining the Connecting the Dots podcast, the CTP Club, thank you all very much for doing so. Follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots because this is rhetoric-free podcast. And let me tell you, those of you that also follow me on my Sirius XM show, Inside the Issues, tomorrow's show is going to be huge. That's all I'll tell you. Tune in. Check it out. See y'all next week. Again, Jim Kavanaugh will join us on Monday. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful, wonderful, safe holiday. Don't eat too much. Peace. Or eat as much as you want. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
All right.